Thank you for coming. I know it's brisk out and it's not that much warmer in here, but when the music starts, hopefully it'll warm you up. On the program, for those of you who attended the last concert, and if you didn't, please know that we did a concert of 3 pieces in the first program that were all works where the orchestra is an accompanist to either singers or background to a play. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, not so much about the history of the orchestra music, I should say, so much as how things have changed over the centuries. And so, as you would imagine, when orchestra, or at least small ensembles, started performing in the, let's say, late 16th century, before then actually, but I'll start there. Much of what the orchestra musicians were doing, and I'm talking about people playing non-vocal instruments like you see here today with strings, woodwinds, brasses, and percussion. Much of what they were doing was really accompanying the voice, or accompanying dance, or playing music. For instance, one of the pieces we did in our first program was incidental music to a play by Sibelius, and all of the pieces that Sibelius wrote for that set of incidental pieces was specifically music to be played before the play starts, what's called entr'acte or interlude pieces when the scene's being changed, as a way of course, sustaining the mood of the play, or perhaps portraying the action that had already happened, and perhaps the action, and, in a sense, carrying the plot line forward. And you all know, because music has, of course, been created for ballet, for modern dance, that instrumentalists like myself have gotten used to playing in groups and ensembles and orchestras to accompany dance. But most notably, probably the most dominant form that most people are aware of, certainly Western European-based, if you'll mind that particular genre, is opera. This large form that's made up a whole series of pieces, individual pieces that advance the plot or the story. And much of what happens in opera is individuals singing what's called arias or airs, either an individual woman or a man, or sometimes in Strauss what's called a pants role, where a woman sings a role of a male role, or small ensembles of 3 or 4 singers, or choruses, again accompanied by orchestra. So pieces that are written specifically for orchestra really don't start coming into their own until the Baroque. And in the Baroque era, we have some kind of pre-symphony works that are referred to as suites, a suite of movements. And there are some works that are referred to as sinfonias, but they're not really the same as our modern, or I should say the Beethoven symphonies, let's say. So the 3 dominant forms that have been with us for upwards of 150 or 200 years or more are the symphony, and we're not doing one tonight, this afternoon, but I want you to know that most of our concerts feature a symphony by Beethoven or Brahms or Haydn or Mozart or Prokofiev. But in this particular concert, we're doing 2 genre pieces that are very, I'll say, typical of the symphonic tone poem, which is a specific form that Liszt created pretty much in the mid-19th century, around 1740, 1750, and the concerto, which has actually been with us much longer than the 200 years I mentioned, because you all know there are concertos by Bach for keyboard, for violin, for oboe, and of course multiple concertos by composers such as Vivaldi and Telemann in the Baroque. In other words, the early part of the 1700s. The form of the first piece we're doing on the program, on Andromeda, or Andromeda, is an example of a symphonic tone poem. And they're very, very unique and kind of interesting in that, as I said, they are one of these 3 dominant types of pieces or genres for orchestra, which have been used not exclusively, but mostly in the last 150 or so years. A symphonic tone poem has a backstory. So if you look at a list of Franz Liszt's 12 or 13 tone poems, or in the instance of Holmes, the composer of Andromeda, she composed 6 or 7 tone poems. They're freestanding works. They're not separate movements like a symphony or a concerto, and they have one continuous arc where the tempos were changed, the mood will change, and as I said, the purpose of it is to necessarily reflect perhaps a literary work. In the instance of the Holmes, it's based on the myth, the Greek myth of Andromeda, a woman chained to a rock and then saved from a sea monster by Perseus, Pegasus, the flying horse. And in fact, the earliest tone poems by Liszt included, among others, symphonic tone poem Prometheus, after which this orchestra is named. The Titan, the pre-Greek god, I should say, who gifted fire to man and was punished for it by the gods. And these works, as I said, have tempo changes in them, but they're pretty much continuous without pause. And curiously enough, unlike movements of symphonies or concertos, which in each era are usually of a certain length, they can be quite expansive. So for instance, this particular work is under 20 minutes, but some of the tone poems of Liszt, and in fact, probably the greatest practitioner or composer, I should say, of tone poems, Richard Strauss, are upwards of an hour long. And so for instance, for those of you who know the very famous movie of Stanley Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey, much of the music that you listen to at the beginning and interspersed throughout, that was a nice pun, interspersed throughout is also Sprach Zarathustra, Thus Spake Superman, or Super Being, by Richard Strauss. So as I mentioned, they grow up tone poems in the mid-19th century, so of course that's the era of romantic music, post-Beethoven, of Robert Schumann, Brahms, and many other dramatic composers, either German or French, such as Berlioz. Very wonderful works. The last piece on the program, of course, is by Brahms, Johannes Brahms, the master composer, the great titan of the symphony, who, by the way, one of the stories I like to tell, although we're not doing the first symphony of Brahms, is Brahms, like all composers, at least the ones who were cognizant of what was going on in life, were really, after Beethoven, were very much influenced and under the shadow of Beethoven's titanic works, opera, which is the plural of opus, the 9 symphonies. And Brahms spent something like 20 years working on his first symphony before he finally allowed it to be performed, and it was a spectacular piece and continues to be. One of the reasons why he only, unfortunately, composed 4 symphonies. But in the instance of today's program, as I mentioned, you have a concerto, and concertos, when they began in the Baroque, were much shorter in length, as were symphonies when they started in the 1750s. And most of the concertos of Bach and Vivaldi and Telemann were only 15 or 20 minutes in length. And of course, the important aspect that the reason why I'm giving this talk is that the concerto form, of course, shows off not the human voice, not accompanying a dancer, not background for a play, or music to be played between acts of a play, but in fact shows off the technical capabilities and the musicianship and the aesthetic of the individual performer as they recreate the work composed by the great composer. And in the Brahms, we have, I'm a violinist. It was one of the last works that I studied myself, the Brahms Violin Concerto. It's a tremendous piece. The arc of the piece is quite spectacular. It rivals that of the Beethoven Violin Concerto. Those are the 2 pieces that I think every violinist aspires to be able to play, or at least enjoy somebody else playing them, who can play them well. And today you're going to be in for a very, very special treat, and I'll be introducing her later, but the soloist, Ava Pakian, performed with us several years ago at the wise ancient age of 12. In the Prokofiev Second Violin Concerto, I invited her back to play the Brahms with us, and she's graciously agreed to come and play for us. This is a work very typical of the 19th and 20th century concerto that features an individual, as I said, could be a violinist, cellist, pianist, any of the woodwinds or brasses, and even percussion. They're concertos for timpani. That really shows off all of the aspects and maturity of an individual artist, accompanied by orchestra, but really very much an interactive way, where the orchestra individuals, especially with superb Brahms composer, understands that at times they'll have the soloist being accompanied by full orchestra, and it is a full orchestra. Sometimes the soloist is accompanied by individuals. Sometimes there's just a little bit of a duet action back and forth between, say, an oboe or a flute or a clarinet or a horn and the soloist. A tremendous work, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. So please enjoy yourselves and have a lot of fun, especially as I've been telling the orchestra the last few weeks as a respite to the kind of scary things that are going on out there.